communicate with each other and ensure that our clients' best interests are upheld. And, so it's a whole new definition of cooperation. That stuff was in there before, but the commission part has been completely taken out. All right, number 3, eliminate and prohibit MLS participants, subscribers, and sellers from making any offers of compensation in the MLS to buyer brokers or other buyer representatives. Number 4, require the MLS to eliminate all broker compensation fields and compensation information in the MLS. Number 5, require the MLS not to create, facilitate, or support any non-MLS mechanism, including by providing listing information to an internet aggregator website for such purpose, for participants, subscribers, or sellers to make offers of compensation to buyer brokers or other buyer representatives. There's been ideas floated out there saying, well, if we don't get it in the MLS, can't we just have this other little website over there that tells everybody what the commission is based on what is in the MLS? No, can't do that, okay? Number 6, prohibit the use of MLS data or data feeds to directly or indirectly establish or maintain a platform of offers of compensation from MLS brokers or other buyer representatives. Such use must result with the MLS terminating the participant's access to any MLS data or data feeds. So if you got the wild hair saying, well, I actually am an MLS subscriber, I can pull down the MLS and I can create my own little site that agents can come to and get their information. You can't do that either. Reinforce that MLS participants and subscribers must not, and MLSs must not, enable the ability to filter out or restrict MLS listings that are communicated to customers or clients based on the existence or level of compensation offered to the cooperating broker or the name of the brokerage or agent. So this is really kind of, I think, after the fact. Most MLSs really weren't doing this anywhere. HAR didn't allow you to search by compensation, but there were some MLSs that did. So you wonder why we got sued is because agents were actually saying, which one can I get paid the most on? That's the ones I'm going to show my clients. Number 8, require compensation disclosures to sellers and prospective sellers and buyers. That's what we're going to go through today. And require MLS participants working with a buyer to enter into a written agreement with the buyer prior to touring a home. That's also what we're going to talk about today. You can get all this information by going to the NAR website, nar.realtor, the facts, and you can see all this information there. And then this was, I think, important information that she put in there concerning the Texas Occupation Code, which we fall under because we're licensees. There is not an in-between. There is no way for an agent to show a buyer a home as customer unless that agent is working with the seller as a subagent, if not part of the listing broker's office. And subagency requires authorization of the listing broker. You would have to contact the listing broker to determine if subagency was authorized. How many of you have been in the business for more than 25 years? Do you even remember subagency, Tracy? I mean, that's how it was way back then, right? So about the time I got my license in 98, somewhere around the mid-90s, buyer agency was really kind of becoming the new thing. They came up with buyer agent classes. You could actually have a buyer agent agreement. And so prior to that, everybody was practicing what we call subagency, which means that the buyer wasn't necessarily being represented. Everybody worked for the seller, irregardless of who you were helping. Well, everyone said, that's stupid. I'm working with this buyer. Their best interest is in my best interest. I'm going to do the right thing for them. I'm going to make sure they're protected and, walk them all the way through this transaction. So I'm really acting as the buyer's agent. And so they eventually moved to this buyer agency role. When that happened, most brokerages said, I don't want subagency anymore. In fact, as a brokerage, we have basically tried to tell everybody that when you're entering a listing into the MLS, you should put 0 as compensation for a subagent to keep them away from bringing a buyer, an unrepresented buyer, to our deal and get paid for it, right? So that's why when you entered listings, you saw there was both a field for buyer agency and subagency. And we always wanted people to put 0 for subagency, okay? Well, This is kind of going into the same conversation saying, well, if you're not getting a buyer representation agreement signed, are you acting as a sub-agent? And the question then would be, is the listing brokerage even going to allow sub-agency? We are not going to allow sub-agency at Keller Williams Northeast, okay? We need people to be represented or sign documentation that says that they are going to be unrepresented and there's no compensation being paid to whoever is working with them. An attorney, if they want to represent themselves, whatever, okay? All right, some important dates that are coming up. First one was Monday, the 24th. The Texas Realtor forms went into effect. Now, I don't really like the word effect. I think it was basically they are available. Okay, so they're all on Texas Realtors right now. How many of you have ever been to the Texas Realtors website? I would really encourage you to go and log in. You have to set up your account. You're paying for it. When you pay your HAR dues, you're paying your TR dues. So go take advantage of that Texas Realtor website. In there is a link for the forms. And you can look at all the current forms. You can look at forms that are under revision, and you can see forms that have been recently approved or adopted. So they kind of have it divided up for you. I had to correct a vendor the other day who sent out an email saying, come see all the new track forms. Not track. Track hasn't changed anything because track doesn't do listing agreements or buyer representation agreements. They only deal with contracts. Texas Realtors has done the listing agreements and the buyer rep agreements and the amendments related to those. So, you know, there's people that get that confused. Is it a track form, a TR form? Here's the easiest way. Track deals with contracts. They do not deal with listing agreements or buyer representation agreements. You won't find a listing agreement or a buyer rep agreement on the TREC website. Okay. So the 24th, they went into effect. However, there's probably still changes being made. As we speak, there's some changes that they're still talking about making. And I understand, talking to Karen Adams, that .loop has already updated. Like zip forms too. And if not far behind it, I'm sure DocuSign. So they're there in our templates as we speak. Next date that's coming up, July 9th, the concession field will be added to MLS. We'll talk about that here in a minute as we talk through the forms. But previously, concessions, if you had a seller who was wanting to offer a concession, you could not advertise that to the public in agent remarks. I mean, public remarks. You could in agent remarks, right? You could in your, only agents can see this part. So you could talk about the fact that the seller was willing to contribute, $5,000 towards discount points or repair expenses or something like that. That is now all going to be one field called seller concession, and it'll be an amount. It will not be a percentage. Percentages get us in trouble sometimes with people. So it's going to be an amount, and it can be something your seller can advertise to the potential buyer out there. And we'll talk about why they might want to do that as one of their choices.
Understanding that even though they put it in there, that's not a guarantee.
That's correct. I mean, it's my seller will consider a concession of this. Yeah. So it's no different than my seller will consider leaving the fridge. There is no commission in the MLS. And you need to get rid of the word commission. You need to wipe it from the face of the earth. It's now compensation. Now we'll talk about your strategy here in a minute. All right, next date, July 9th. Oh, July 9th we covered. July 12th, the Broker Lawyer Committee is meeting to review TREC purchase contract forms. So the Broker Lawyer Committee, which does the TREC forms, is going to be meeting here in the next couple of weeks to look at contract forms and see if there's any modifications that might need to be made with those contracts as it relates to changes that are being made in the industry. On August 16th, the MLS offer of compensation commission will be removed from the MLS. You don't have to do anything. That field is going away. It will just automatically be removed. And then the next day, the NAR settlement agreement and policy changes go into effect. So that's the big date, is August 16th and 17th is when all this is hitting the fan. TREC commissioner meeting will take place in August and look at anything that the broker lawyer committee may have considered changing. And then probably sometime by the end of the year, if TREC is feeling the need to make changes, they'll probably put new contract forms out sometime in the fourth quarter or early 2025 as it relates to that. All right, so let's talk about new forms. So broker compensation, or the sharing of compensation between brokers, is not set by law. This is language that's been added to all the agreements. Not controlled or recommended or suggested by the Associated Realtors, the MLS, or any listing service. Broker compensation is fully negotiable. Brokers independently determine their fees. Broker is prohibited from receiving compensation for brokerage service from any source that exceeds the amount stated in this agreement. We'll talk about that. Also added to the listing forms, broker compensation is not set by law. So it's kind of the same language there, is that they've got this big statement in all the agreements saying there's no set fees. It's all negotiable. So work it out with your agent. Commission is now compensation, Tracy, and a prospect is now a client. There's no more prospects. Everybody is a client because they're going to end up signing a form, okay? All right, so let's go through the forms, and you've kind of got them there in front of you. So the buyer tenant representation agreement, this is the long form, I think is the first one you've got in your package, right? Yeah, and that's the change up at the top. They actually have the word long form. So they really took the previous buyer rep agreement, made these changes to it, and titled it long form. And you'll see why in a minute, because they came up with a new form, which is called the short form. Yes. Yeah.
Still get a law.
And no more loss than they were before.
No,
Right.
Then they're gonna try to use this.
I know. Well, of course, it looks really bad right now with a lot of stuff stricken and all that. When it get cleaned up and it's not highlighted and all that, I agree. Yeah, I'm with you on that. But if you've had a reason, and we've told this to our agents for 20 years, if you had a reason to use the TR buyer rep agreement, use it. There's sometimes you needed to use that form. Yeah, they're not called Texas Realtors. They're called Texas Realtors. They dropped the association from their name about 5 years ago. So I still sometimes say TAR, but I've gotten really better at saying TR. I know. Yeah. Yeah. We, as a brokerage, came up with our own buyer tenant representation agreement probably close to 20 years ago. And we did it because we saw that agents were struggling with the 5-page TR form. And we quickly saw that people adopted that form a lot better because it was shorter, it was more concise, it was to the point. Obviously, it left out some things that couldn't be included because you got to get down to 2 pages. And we've already sent a draft to our attorney to get his blessing on that form. We kind of talked about getting rid of it and just using the short form, but we kind of also thought that there's a lot of people really used to our form, and we just wanted to make it compliant with the new disclosures. So we've done that, and we're waiting for our attorney to bless it. And once he does, we'll have it digitized and available in the platforms as quickly as we can. All right. Let's talk about this green language here. Notice regarding bonuses or other compensation. In addition to the broker's fees specified under the paragraph 7A, so that's what you're getting as a buyer's agent, the seller or their landlord or agent may offer the broker other compensation such as a bonus. If the client purchases or leases certain properties, broker will disclose the specific amount of other compensation offered to the broker. The broker may not receive other compensation unless the client authorizes it in writing. So there's an amendment form to the buyer representation agreement where you would document the buyer giving you approval to receive a bonus. More than what you said you charge. So your buyer rep agreement says, I'm going to charge this. But you're working in a situation where somebody's offering a bonus. And in order for you to collect that, you would need to get the buyer to approve it in writing. Okay? Yeah. Okay.
I have a buyer that is looking at my listing. He wants to represent himself. However, he is asking that the seller pays the buyer's agent commission as closing costs for his taxes and HOA, etc. Told him that wasn't allowed because he's not a licensed agent, so he can't get a commission.
So that's not true. That's anything we're talking about today doesn't change that scenario. That's been going on for a long time. A principal to the transaction can receive part of the commission in the old ways, right? So if you were savvy enough to guide yourself through the deal, you could approach the listing agent and say, I'm representing myself, and I know you probably were offering 3% to a buyer's agent out there, and my offer is going to be that 3% be credited towards my closing cost. That's permissible. There's nothing that says that can't happen. I would want in the contract for there to be something stated that the buyer was offered and declined representation, just to make sure that there's no question later on going, well, I didn't know, I could have gotten representation. So document the fact that he was offered and he declined representation is a good thing to do. Yeah.
Bonus, what scenario would that be like?
All right, so Terry's got a listing that's been sitting for a while, and all of a sudden her seller's going, we got to move it, we got to move it. And in her listing agreement, she actually secured compensation for the buyer's agent. So you've called her and she said, yes, you're going to get your 3%. And yesterday I got permission to offer a $1,500 BTSA. Oh yeah, new construction will do it when things get slow. They come, you know, when they show up with meals, business is slow. And bonuses. Now you have to document it, and you would want to document it on new construction too. They can do it after the fact. It just has to, after the fact, it's going to have to be approved. The buyer's going to have to approve their agent receiving that money. So. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I need to be on the date of August 17th.
Yep.
How do you go about the compensation?
Yep. It will need to be amended. And there's a new amendment to the listing agreement, and there's a new amendment to the buyer tenant representation agreement with all these new disclosures in there, so that if you currently had a listing agreement on the old form and your listing hasn't sold by the time or under contract by the time August 17th comes around, you will need to get it amended. And as a staff, we've already started the strategy of how do we help our agents stay in compliance with that, because we know you don't turn in your listing paperwork for compliance approval until you have a contract. So we're going to start pulling inventory and start asking to see your listing agreement prior to that date, because people need to be working on it. You can't wait till August 17th to get your paperwork compliant.
Agreement signed before we actually make the offer.
We're going to get to that, Tracy. You're ahead of me. Okay. Mm-hmm.
Have a listing, doesn't sell by the time August 17th.
Yep.
And you already went through compliance and they've already approved it. Do you have to go in and?
Yep. You'll have to amend it. We're going to go through all the current compliances and make sure either they have you either used the new listing agreement or you got an amendment included. Yeah. Yeah.
If you're ready to write a contract, can you go ahead and use the new paperwork? You
I'm
have to wait until August 17th.
Say, no, you can start using the new paperwork today. There's nothing to preclude you from using. In fact, that was kind of Karen's question yesterday, is like, all right, I got somebody who's wanting to take a listing and the old forms are gone. and they haven't been through a class to even look at the new forms yet. What do they do? And so we figured a workaround for them, but they finally came back and said, no, they decided to use the new form. Perfect. Not yet. All right. So the next form we're going to talk about is the short form. So right behind the long buyer rep agreement is the short form. It's 1 page long. It being short, they had to remove a lot of stuff from it, but it basically has all the appropriate disclosures concerning compensation, that negotiations are, available, and blah, blah, blah. I guess the one thing that I would point out about both the long form and the new form, and even our Keller Williams form, is that we've always had the language in there that said, here's how much I charge to represent you. And then there was a sentence in there that says, I will seek first to receive that compensation from the seller or their agent. But if those parties refuse to pay it, you're paying it, right? Remember that language that's in there? That's still there. And now it really means something, because there will be some sellers out there and some listing brokerages that do not have compensation for you or your buyer. So that's when you're going to have a conversation with your buyer and go over that with them. And you really want to have that conversation with them at the time they sign the form, not when you're looking at houses and go, oh, by the way, this one isn't going to pay a commission. You remember that form you signed last week? You're going to owe me $10,000. Right? That's not the time to have that conversation. You need to do it up front, be proactive about it, make sure that they understand that. All right. So you've got that short form, and we're going to be working on the Keller Williams Northeast form for you too. Okay. Let's look at the listing agreement. So the next form in your package should be the listing agreement.
It has full services or showing services on there, so I guess.
What's the difference? Right. I mean, I think you could probably come up with, obviously, your list of full service, right? What that would include. A showing service is basically, is it worth my time to drive to the other side of town to unlock that door for you if you're not going to sign a buyer rep agreement? Would you pay me $75 or $100 or whatever your number is, right? And they'll say, yeah, I'll pay you that, but I don't want to sign any agreements with an agent right now. Well, they would be signing that form for the ability to view the property. You're still not representing them. But if you were collecting a fee from them, you would need to get that form signed before showing the property. Well, I think there's really there's several scenarios on listings, and we're in the listing agreement now. So let me kind of go through the scenarios first, and maybe that'll answer your question. Okay. So you basically now have three ways that a seller can decide about compensation. Okay. The first is what I would call the traditional way, what we've been used to. You're the listing agent, you sit down with your seller, you tell them about the lawsuit, however you decide to do that. You share with them that there's now a new way to compensate agents, and here's compensation form number 1. You're going to pay me 6%. I'm going to share 50% of that with the agent that brings the buyer to the transaction, right? The traditional way, okay? Your other option, Mr. Seller, is to pay me my fee. I charge 3%. You can then also advertise that you're willing to pay a concession towards the buyer's closing cost. And that can be of any amount. 3% seems to be a good number, right? Oh, we'll talk about that in a minute. That could be there's an amount, right? And so that's this new concession field that the MLS is coming up with. So your seller up front says, I like that model better. I'm willing to pay you your fee and offer a concession to cover the buyer's closing cost of such and such amount. Okay. The third choice is I'm not willing to do anything. I'll pay your fee, and that's it. No concession, no compensation to another agent. You know, do your best, right? Now, that doesn't mean that after he's been on the market for a month, he can change his mind and say, tell me about those compensation things again. And you can modify your agreement with them. Okay. It also doesn't mean that the buyer's agent, in writing their offer to the seller, can't ask for a big concession that would most likely probably cover their commission. It's an offer. The seller can decide if they want to do that or not do that, right? So just the fact that they said, I don't want to pay anything, doesn't mean that they don't eventually pay something, right? I mean, how many times have we been sitting down to the seller going, this is my final number? And then they move just a little bit more, right? You know, they'll change their mind. So the same thing could happen at the listing appointment. So I don't know if that answers your question or not, but sellers have the option up front to indicate what they're willing to do. Doesn't mean they can't change their mind after the fact once the offer comes in. Now, I would say if they agree to pay your 6% or your 5% or whatever your number is, that's in the listing agreement. That the negotiation of that was prior to signing the listing agreement. When they keep saying things are negotiable, they are until they're reduced to writing. And then the negotiations kind of end at that point, right? I know sometimes they don't. You sometimes still have to make a deal to make the deal work, but you know, they keep saying commissions are negotiable all the way up until closing. Right, some. Okay. All right. Same thing on the listing agreement is the language concerning bonuses. That if they decide to offer a bonus, you'll come back and give them the documentation for that. All right, let's look at the amendment forms. So the first amendment I think you've got is the amendment to the listing. TXR form 1404, amendment to listing. Should be right behind the listing agreement, if they're in the same order as they were the other day. So this would be a scenario where I have an old listing agreement and August 16th is approaching and I need to get in compliance with the choices concerning compensation. Even if they're not changing their deal, we signed a deal, we're going to pay you 6%, blah, blah, blah. You still would want to get an amendment signed because it discloses all this language in there. We have to get this disclosure language in front of them. So they need to sign the amendment, even if they're not changing anything, just to make sure that they've seen the fact that commissions are not set by law, blah, 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 all that language, okay? It would also be a scenario where you're using the new form and then subsequently something changes. It still covers changing the date, changing the price, changing other aspects of the listing. The amendment form just now includes this specific language concerning compensation and this disclosure language so that you can utilize it in this period of time where we've got old forms and new disclosures. Okay. All right. So seller's authorization to disclose and advertise certain information. This would come into play when the seller authorizes the broker to disclose to other brokers and buyers that seller will consider contributing an amount up to a certain amount towards the buyer's expense. So you would need to get that form signed if you're now going to offer that compensation part out there in the MLS, okay? That concession in the MLS. Again, seller's not obligated to pay the amount. It's basically saying, I'm willing, but I'm not obligated to do it, which kind of goes back to your question, Roland. And in the event that the amount of contribution is included in the MLS service, such amount cannot be limited to or conditioned upon the retention of a payment to a cooperating broker, buyer's broker, or other buyer representative.
So if the seller agrees to pay a certain compensation, if it's 6%, let's just use that for now. And then where I'm reading this on the second line.
This would only be for the concession language.
And it only goes, obviously, if we check on paragraph F, that yes, they do want to, and then that form will outline the details of how much.
Right.
But this says buyer may use these funds to pay the buyer's broker fees or other expenses payable to by the buyer under the sales contract.
That's right.
So that's what I'm saying. So, but then it says seller is not obligated to pay the amount or any other amount unless the seller agrees to such payment in the sales contract. So if he's already got it set up at 6%, then.
Yeah, I don't know that you're going to have a situation where it's both, right? I mean, I think you're going to have a situation where you're going to use this form in an instance where the seller is only paying your side of the commission, but says, you know, Roland, I really think that idea of offering a concession is a better way of marketing my property. I'd rather just pay your 3%. Let's put an approximate amount, something close to 3% as a seller concession out there so that you can advertise that on the MLS.
Now, if they say, put it in that concession field, and then it's up to the buyer to use it however they want to, and they.
Well, number one, you still got to get a contract. Still got to get a contract, and it would be up to reduce to writing in the contract, which is probably not going to change immediately. That paragraph 12 is still going to say this amount is going to be used first towards buyer's closing costs, such as blah, 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 right? And we had this conversation the other day when, what's her face was in the room from the mortgage company. Christy was in the room. And, you know, back when I was actively practicing, you know, I had lenders that were sitting there saying, you could write a deal with 6% concession for your buyer. I was going, okay, that sounds great. And then we, you know, write a deal and they didn't have 6% worth of closing costs. They only had about 3% worth of closing costs, right? So who gets to keep the extra 3%? The seller did, right? But the lender was okay with me getting 6% concession back, right? So she had guidelines and she talked about it, whether or not the client was putting 10% down or more or less, and you know, how much the amounts can be one way or the other. So in that world, we're going to have to work really closely with our lenders. And when you're receiving an offer, you're going to really want to have a conversation probably with that buyer's lender about their need for concessions, especially if you've got a scenario where you're paying a concession in lieu of a commission. Okay.
There's buyers that need a concession from the get-go. That doesn't include.
That's right. But that's kind of what I was saying, Morgan, is that most of the time that's only probably about 2.5%, maybe 3.5%. It was hard to ever get up to 5 or 6% total concession. So if you really could get up to that number, you probably are going to be okay as long as still as it appraises, right?
So if you've got a buyer's rep agreement that says they'll pay you 3%, and then you've got a listing that says it's 3% built in.
As a concession. You're covered.
Then the buyer is obligated to pay you that.
So at closing, that you're going to provide a DA for your amount, and it's going to be a buyer closing cost. It's not going to be a seller expense up at the top. The concession is going to be, you know, moved over to cover that amount.
Is that binding to the buyer?
It is. The buyer rep agreement is.
Okay.
Same as the listing agreement.
Yeah, I understand, but how enforceable?
It's as enforceable as the listing agreement.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me say that. I'm just.
I know. Well, and I think here's been the scenario, Roland, is we've kind of had this loosey-goosey buyer rep agreement. You know, we really only need this if it's an intermediary. Well, you need it now. Could you put a property on the market without a listing agreement? No. And the MLS is going to supposedly police if there's ever a complaint, they may come and ask you, we want to see a copy of your buyer rep agreement. Just as you should have been prepared to provide them a copy of a listing agreement, you would want to provide them that also. Yes, ma'am.
And the buyer agrees to pay 3%, but in a situation when that buyer needs that 3% concession, then it's not your 3%.
Yeah, so what do you do as a buyer's agent? Negotiate. You're making an offer with 6% concession. Concession in that scenario where the listing brokerage is not offering compensation. Correct. Yep. Don't have to worry about it. But there is a form we'll have to worry about in that scenario, and that's coming up. All good so far? Yeah, remember, we're just getting used to these forms, so. All right, next form, TXR 2701 is a new form. It's the amendment to the buyer, to the representation agreement. And so this would be in those scenarios where you need to make a change to a current buyer representation agreement. So you had a buyer representation agreement signed in April, and you still haven't found anything. And August 17th rolls around. Guess what you need? An amendment to that buyer representation agreement stating all of the options concerning commission and the disclosures in there, or get the new buyer rep agreement signed. Either amend it or replace it. All right, so this is going to be the next one. TXR 2401, compensation agreement between broker and owner. So this was previously called the registration between broker and owner. So some people called this our one-time showing agreement, you know, that kind of deal. This was the form you would use for sale by owners when you had a buyer and you wanted to make an offer on a for sale by owner. You wanted to get your commission secured before making the offer. So you'd meet with the for sale by owner and go over all the information and give them the IABS and get the agreement between broker and owner signed so that you got paid 3% if your buyer's offer was accepted. They changed the name and they added all of the logistical information concerning compensation and disclosures. All right, now here comes the big one. TXR 2402. This form has kind of been out there, but we really never had to use it. You will need to use it now. In the scenarios where you called Roland, I've got buyer for Roland's listing, he goes, good news. We're paying 3% buyer compensation. Oh, woohoo, I don't have to worry about concessions. Yes, let's make an offer. Well, I would need to get the listing broker's agreement to pay the 3% because previously that compensation agreement was in the MLS. It was implied with the 3% being offered as a buyer's commission. Now I've got to document the fact that Roland said, I'm paying you 3%.
Out of the.
They're paying it out of their listing fee. They're Well, there was never a compensation agreement in the contract. It was a notation.
Yeah.
It was for informational purposes only. So maybe I could see it, Morgan. I don't know if you've really ever spent much time looking at commercial forms. It could start looking like that, where there's kind of some language in the contract about who's paying who. That's in the commercial forms. So they may do something like that. We'll see. So don't forget this form whenever you do have a listing agent who goes, great news, I'm willing to pay 3%. We're paying 3% compensation. If you bring a buyer that my seller accepts, you would want to include this with the offer to get your compensation documented. Okay. No, this would be with the offer. Think of it as the agreement between brokers on a lease agreement. All right, Form 2406, addendum regarding. Form 2406, new form, addendum regarding broker's fee. This form is to be signed by buyer and seller, acknowledging the obligation of the parties to pay the broker compensation. This would be an amendment to the contract, an addendum to the contract. The listing fee per the listing agreement and the other fees as it relates to the buyer's fees. So that's the last form there that you've got kind of in your package is this addendum regarding broker's fees. So this probably kind of replaces that last paragraph on the contract, maybe. Just to let the title company kind of know where's money coming from on this deal. And the lender.
So, because this one is between the brokers, and then this
And then
one
the
is.
other one
Between the parties. Yeah. Now, this could be something they might eventually move into the contract.
Yeah.
So, yes, ma'am.
Like, seller's concession of X% or X amount, this amount.
Well, in the forms, it always has to be a dollar amount. It cannot be a percentage. In the MLS, it cannot be a dollar. It cannot be a percentage. It has to be a dollar amount. When you're making your offer, you could explain the request for the concession, but there's no need to separate it here.
Like breaks down, I know it needs to be applied towards the buyer's costs first, but for your part, can you itemize your part or not? Because at the end of the day, they could keep it and not give you your concession. Being the buyer's rep.
Well, it's all going to happen at closing, right? So the seller concession is supposed to go towards the buyer's closing cost. You've turned in an invoice at closing for part of the buyer's closing cost, just as the lender did for their fees and for everything else. So your CDA is an invoice for the buyer to be paid at closing. Correct. Yeah. Now they could probably say, where is this coming from? Say, well, remember this form you signed? This is where it happened. And I can't imagine anybody's really going to be super confused at closing. Hopefully everyone's had enough conversations about it. The last form in your package, and I think really only have page 1 of 5, is the general information and notice to buyers and sellers. They added the compensation means any commission fee or other valuable consideration. So that form just got updated. We've never required this form as a brokerage. I know there's some agents that really like to use it. And if you still like to use it, keep using it. That form has been updated with this compensation language in there. So, all right, we are 10 till 2. So now all of your questions can remember. Let me say this. You know, I think there's still some people that are under the perception that this lawsuit by these sellers was because they didn't understand how it worked. They absolutely understood how it worked. Okay. If people think that it was a thing that people just didn't understand how commissions work, there was an activist out there that found an attorney who took up his cause, and they went and found sellers and said, we can make this work. All right. So there was these weren't uneducated people. They just didn't like it, and they didn't think it was fair. So that's where the lawsuit came from. And the quicker we get to the point of going, it's done, it's over, this is the new world moving forward, the better everybody's going to be. Terry?
These changes.
That's exactly right.
Just trying to look out for our client.
Sure.
And then
it's our job to explain all of this, and I'm just trying to figure out what
Yeah.
really changed.
I think that the challenge is that we probably did a poor job of explaining it before. And we really screwed ourselves by telling buyers that their representation was free. It was never free. They paid for it every single time they paid for it in the price of the house.
That's the way they could look at it. On the
Right.
buyer's side, they could look at, well, I'm paying for it, I'm paying out of my house.
Yeah.
And the seller's like, well, I'm paying for it, it's coming out of my proceeds. So it's clarifying.
Yeah. We did a poor job of letting people know how commissions work because we were afraid to talk about it. Oh, yeah, you want to list with me? Just sign here. We always thought they were most concerned about the price and what they netted.
Have the option of using a long form versus a short form.
For buyer rep, well, you have the choice of three now. You have the long form, which you've always had. You've got the new short form, or our future revised Keller Williams Northeast buyer form. So that one is not updated yet. So if you see it out there, it's still the old form. I think Jay brought it into me. So I've played with it and Michael's blessed it and I've sent it to our attorney and we're waiting for him to bless it also. And once he's blessed it, we'll get it out there as quickly as we can. So you can still use the one that's there up until August 16th. Okay.
If you watch the HAR webinar, like
Mhm.
Oh,
it
yeah.
basically said that, you can't even copy the HAR site, like you put it on Facebook. If you do, you can't say compensation, you can't.
Can't say commission.
Commission of anything.
Yeah.
But if you take a picture of your house, of the house that you have listed, and say, just listed, can you put in the verb, if you didn't copy it off of, if you didn't take the listing off of that site, and you can't say anything about your MLS on a separate website that says compensation in it.
Yeah.
That's what he said. He goes, you can't.
Yeah, they're trying very hard to create a wall between compensation and the data that they're providing. I think, well, they don't want any more lawsuits. I mean,
He said if you copy you just create an ad off of MLS, you can't say anything about, because it's basically saying that the MLS is offering 3%. It's basically saying it's on the MLS.
Michael and Neil said that we could put, like, we want to advertise on our social media or
Yeah.
on the Northeast, we can.
But you can't copy that MLS.
Link it to the MLS, but
Can't
we
link
can
it
put
to
the
the-
address of the property, a picture of
Yeah.
our property, saying we're offering compensation. I guess we can't use the word commission, so we have to say.
yeah, you want to use compensation.
But we just can't have a.
Anything with the IDX fee going back to hard.
Right.
You can't have it.
Yeah, that's what he's saying. You can't copy anything off of.
I was reading an article yesterday, I guess it came out from Inman, that of course, this has now created a new gap that companies are trying to fill by offering platforms for agents to advertise their compensation on. There's like five new tech forms that came
I
up.
said from the beginning, it's the listing agent has all the control. They're the ones, when you go and, present your offer. I mean, even if we get, because we do that, I mean, sometimes we take it for 5%. We never give the buyer, we never take the 3%. We always give the 3%.
Right.
To the buyer's agent, because we feel that's who's gonna 90% of the time sell the house. So your buyer, your sellers are gonna be grateful that they can get, the house sold. And to be honest with you, Don and I have already come to the conclusion that if they don't even like the 5%, if they don't want to give anything to the buyer's agent, then the conversation's over. We just can't, this industry, the buyer's agents are not gonna survive.
Well, that conversation's so different than someone saying, I want you to list it for 1%. I'm not gonna do that.
No, you're not gonna do that.
Yeah.
I mean, it's.
You have a standard and there's nothing wrong with you as an agent creating a standard. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
you know, Donna's pretty good at it. You know, she does 99% of the listings, and she's got her, you know, presentation down.
And I think what's going to happen is between now and August, we're going to have people that have kind of created a little bit of best practices, and they've kind of got their jargon down, and we're going to have a lot of training over, hey, this worked, you know, this is the language, just as we did before. So, yeah, Terry.
For sell by owners.
Yeah, the 1% brokerages that popped up.
Because to me, that's the kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that number comes out annually from NAR, and there for a while, it was averaging about 8%. That they were, yeah, I mean, the last ones I saw was about 8%. So if they had hired an agent and paid them 6%, they would have made 2% more. So they're just leaving money on the table by being a force of bond.
That builder that all of a sudden decided they weren't paying compensation.
Yeah, they came back and paid.
They had to come back.
Yeah.
I'm not gonna name his name, but y'all are.
La, 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 la. All right, so I guess the takeaways are for you is, number one is to take a look at your current listing inventory. What listing agreements need to be updated before August 16th? And I guarantee do it sooner than later, right? Don't wait till August 10th to go, all right, I'm gonna work on that project this week. More than likely, the office is gonna start bugging you sometime around mid-July. We're gonna start looking for amendments or new listing agreements, you know, to be uploaded and to prove that you've done it. And that's kind of where Michael and I are on, you know, when will we start saying that if you start taking a new listing, we want to see it on the new forms, probably sometime after the July 9th date, when the concession field is live on the MLS, probably within a week of that time frame. We feel like that's probably a good time to say, all right, you take a new listing, it needs to be on the new listing agreement. You get a new buyer representation agreement, it needs to be on the new buyer representation agreement field. So there's going to be a cutoff as a brokerage, probably sometime around mid-July, that we're going to want you to start using all of the new forms for both buyers and sellers.
Get the numbers, can we say call a listing agent or buyer concession?
Say that again?
Numbers in MLS.
Yes, you can. You can say call listing agent for additional information.
And then that's gonna be fun getting hold of those agents that answer
Yeah.
the phone all the time.
Well, Donna Wilson already has a code word that she's putting in her agent remarks. She goes, this is going to be one of the top 3% houses you see. This house will be in the top 3%.
So we could use our KW website as the landing page, but then we were looking at it, you can't even, because everything's just syndicated, like it goes to Zillow, Realtor.com, you can edit the listing on Realtor.com and Zillow technically, separately, you can do that, but the KW.
The problem is that they're pulling that, they're syndicating that from HAR.
Agent. You can't click it.
That comment was asked a couple of weeks ago at a Keller Williams event, and they talked about potentially, and they said, as of right now, we're not exploring that option. They just settled for $270 million.
Yeah, you can't even advertise, you can't even, if you, like, homes.com and all that, because they syndicate through.
Yep.
MLS.
Yeah. Now the concession will still be available, but not agent compensation.
Closing costs and pay your commission. So we have to have this sign, and they say, we only want to look at homes where they pay your concession.
Yep.
How do we handle, like, what do we put on here? Like, how do we protect ourselves, but also not make them?
I would put that statement in there. I would put it in special provisions that buyer instructs a brokerage to only show properties that would cover the fee that I would owe them, just to get their permission I didn't only show you those because you told me to. You actually signed it right here saying that was. Now you're going to still put your compensation on the form, right? But then I would state in there that buyer instructs buyer's agent to only show properties where the fee in paragraph such and such is covered in that transaction. I mean, to a certain extent, it's really no different than a VA deal, right? You got VA buyers out there that need all the help in the world, right? So you have to go look for properties where that's going to only work for them. Well, you're going to see if there's concession. There's a concession field that'll be out there. So that's part of them. And then there's going to be the others, right? And so now you're not knowing what's being offered. So it's going to be some footwork on behalf of agents to contact those. I'm probably going to show them the house. And then they're like, Dad, doesn't work. I'm not going to call everybody that I'm showing today to say, am I getting paid, not getting paid? Yes. That'll be a public field. No,
It says the buyer's gonna pay you.
but it says first, it says you're going to pay me 3%. I'm going to seek for that to be paid by the listing agent or the seller first. If they refuse to pay me, you owe me. Okay. So you don't have to modify it if all of a sudden you come across a property where the commission's being covered, compensation is being covered. Yes, ma'am. Okay. Don't have to do a thing. All right, now we can go to happy hour, Carrie. I will give you a hint that we're planning a little party on August 16th.
Well, buyers are with what we already presented.
I'm sorry? I know. Yep.
Have you ever decided if the lenders agree to hold like a?
They're all going to have to try to figure it out under the underwriting standards. Yeah.
Guess it depends on the lender.
I mean, they already said that, you know, if you have a buyer putting 10%, 10% or less down, it maxes out at a certain amount. So that's going to be the issue is those people. So I'm going to say this in front of everybody. Get this microphone off. But let's just say you had a situation where it was concession only, sellers only offer, right? And you've got a client that needs as much as they can get for their own closing costs, and that's not going to be. We've made an offer to try to make it work. It's not going to work. So how do we make it work? Could you approach the listing agent and say, is there an opportunity for you to reach? Have a conversation with your seller for him to truly pay you 6%. And you now pay me. So let's take it out of the.
I don't know. Every kind of scenario could be.
Well, to me, we're back to, I thought we're supposed to keep it all clear.
You know, the best thing to do, sell all of your listings before August 16th.
We're going to have a banner August as an office.
And it goes, we need to go to the